Husbands and wives that got divorced after 20 years of marriage, what made you decide to change your mind after all that time? Sounds like my grandpa, except when he started drinking and accusing grandma of cheating, he beat the shit out of her. It all backfired one day though. Grandpa had 7 sons, all really good wrestlers and boxers, because grandpa thought men should know how to fight. One day they ganged up on grandpa, they were 8 to 17, beat the shit out of him, tied him up to a tree, and left him outside all night. Then they told him they'd kill him if he ever drank or hit grandma again. It's crazy to me, because I only ever got to meet the nice version of my grandpa who didn't drink. He tried to kill me, which I feel is impolite. My husband's parents did this. He said he knew his parents weren't happy for a long time. Said they went to family therapy together, but ultimately, once my husband went to the army, he was the younger of 2, they divorced and both later married other people. These 2 could not get along for anything. They hated each other. At our wedding, we had to take separate family pictures with the dad and new wife, and then with the mom and my sister-in-law. It was insane. Cut to about 2 years after our wedding, and I get a phone call from father-in-law's wife of 10 years. She is in hysterics. She had caught him in bed with my mother-in-law. My husband would not believe it until he talked to his father. That was over 10 years ago. My in-laws both divorced their partners and have been together ever since. My mother-in-law has all their old family pictures on display everywhere and acts like they never divorced and have been together for over 4 decades. A friend's parents divorced when she was 8, remarried other people, so she had a stepbrother on one side and a stepsister on the other. Then they both divorced their respective partners about a year apart and remarried each other when my friend was in high school. She said it's weird that there's this several-year period that they all don't talk about, and she sort of had siblings that disappeared with the divorce. When I was 8, my dad threatened to leave my mom because he was threatened by her brother. My uncle didn't do anything wrong, but my dad didn't like another man in his kids' lives because he had fears of abandonment, and getting replaced still has those fears. So he gave my mom an ultimatum: it's your brother or me, you gotta choose. My mom, fearing to hold together a family, chose my dad. My uncle was broken about it because my mom was forced to shut him due to reasons he didn't even understand. Fast forward 6 years and my older brother, now in college, develops an outside view of the family life and began to understand the ashlery of my dad. So my brother called my dad and gave him his full mind on what he thinks of my dad and how he's done petty things out of fear. My dad flipped and blamed my mom for that because he thought she was putting words in his mouth. Things were tense for a bit between my dad, brother, and mother until my dad decided to move out officially because he felt not welcome in the family. That was 5 years ago, and he's been living separately since then, but my parents are still legally married due to joint owning a lot of assets. A year ago, however, I found out that my dad had been dating a 25-year-old for over a year. He's 60. The scary thing was that my mom knew the whole time, but she didn't tell us because she feared how it would make us view our dad. My mom is still very broken up about the fact that it was my dad that left her, despite him having toxic and manipulative behavior toward her, me, and my brothers for the latter part of their 25-year marriage. 23 years. I had lied to her several times over the years, and she always forgave me. The last time I lied to her about accruing a severe amount of debt due to a gambling addiction. I think she might have forgiven the lie, but she couldn't forgive the addiction and the chance I'd start gambling again. I started attending Gamblers Anonymous after I told her, but it was too little too late for her. On the plus side, I haven't gambled in almost 3 years. Edit. I wanted to thank everyone for the support. It was a struggle at first, but it gets easier as long as I take it one day at a time. I've made some amazing friends in my local recovery community, and I run a meeting once a week to help others that are suffering. Had to watch my parents go through the paperwork to get divorced after my dad had a massive stroke and was forced to retire. It was the only way for them to keep the money from his pension and maintain his health insurance coverage. My parents got a divorce of convenience so Pops could make the mortgage payments and get his insulin. Thankfully my parents' insurance agent is a close friend and found every possible form and loophole so they could stay in the house together. It took almost 2 years to get everything settled. I'll never forget my dad's statement after it was all done. The church still says we are married, and that's what matters to us. At least now, your mother can still get her hearing aids and pay the mortgage if something happens to me. I was so disgusted with it all. I never forgave my dad's union for it, and we now make sure someone from our family shows up to their annual open meeting when they discuss their health insurance plan to shame them in explicit detail with how the board fucks over the round X. My parents got divorced after 22 years of marriage. They were never in love and didn't even like each other. They had me and then my sister a few years later and wanted to stay together for the kids 12 years. After I was born they had my brother and that kept the cycle going. I wish I could say they are happy now, but they still like to cause trouble for each other. We are due with our first child soon, and they are gonna have to figure out how to be grandparents together. Thankfully I'm 1,500 miles from them, so it won't be a headache often. I worked at a law firm that only practiced family law, divorces, child custody, wills and estates, etc. At one time we had like 8 clients getting divorced after 20 plus years of marriage, and they were all high-ranking military men whose wives came out of the closet after all their kids had grown up and moved out of the house and the guys were getting ready to retire. I thought it was so weird, but I guess for whatever reason the women thought that their duties to their husbands and families were coming to an end and they wanted to live for themselves. I guess I know why they couldn't come out 30 years ago. It was a different time, but I was curious why they were all attracted to military guys. I assume maybe cause it meant their husbands would be away 4 years at a time during their service. My parents split up after nearly 30 years. My dad was an asshole my entire life, so when they finally divorced, when I was 18, there was no surprise. He'd been cheating for years and I think he was the one who finally asked for it. I think my mom stayed because she couldn't afford to start over. She spent her life putting my dad through school and wasn't educated herself. She had no family or anyone who could help her either. There was definitely some confidence issues on her part too. My husband began surreptitiously going to strip clubs. He stole about $200 a week from various accounts and a business I owned to fund these activities. He lost his job because he went there so often at lunch and would just stay. We had young kids, and so I stayed after he got some therapy. He was never honest with the therapist. About a year ago I learned he was doing it again, plus texting strippers. My youngest kid graduates high school this year. I've done what's best for everyone else for 20 years now. This September was 21 years. I don't anticipate having a 22nd anniversary. It's really scary to think of being alone. I don't hate him. I feel sorry for him. I know he will feel very sad and lonely when I'm gone. But being near him feels like having my soul ripped from my body every day. My mom filed for divorce after 27 years with my dad. Us kids were out of the house and I think she had a midlife crisis thinking that if she decided to do nothing, then that's how she'd die, in that house, doing nothing but things that make the days go by faster. I do believe an old high school flame helped her make the decision as well. At first I was hurt, but as I get older now I completely get why. My dad prefers routine over excitement and had a habit of saving us poor when we didn't need to. At first it was a financial requirement, then it became obsession. My mom wanted to travel and experience new things in her later years. She deserves that, and my dad deserves to live how wants to too. Today I see 2 happier people, and that makes me happy. Not myself, but my parents. They were married for 22 years when they separated, 24 years by the time the divorce was final. From the perspective of a child in the situation, there was no way that they were happy people together. There was hardly ever a quiet moment in the house because of my father's temper, but my mother knew how to serve it back too. However, the final straw was more of a chain of events. My father had a very rigid view of the family. Man works, woman stays home, cares for the home and children. When I was in high school my father got injured at work and needed surgery. He worked a physically demanding job and would be out for 6 months. My mother, knowing that we were already falling behind on vehicle and house payments, decided to find part-time employment. She worked while the kids were in school. It was still important to her to see her kids get on the bus and be there when they got home. My father immediately believed that she was cheating on him. He installed a tracker and tape recorder in her car. He showed up at her workplace and caused a scene multiple times. He questioned her coworkers. He spent most of time at the house drinking. This was not an equal partnership, and it really never was. You should have seen how hurt he acted when my mom finally asked for a divorce. But he rebounded real quick. All he had to do was tell some woman on Plenty of Fish his sob story, and he moved right into her house. He spent a couple of years treating her and her children horribly before she kicked him out. Only took him a couple of weeks in a hotel to find another woman to let him move in. Parents divorced after 25 years when my mom had what we thought at the time was a midlife crisis. She told my dad by draining $3K from the joint checking account to fund her divorce lawyer. 6 years later they were officially divorced since she blew through that money on different lawyers that kept firing her as a client. We later ruled out midlife crisis when her behavior started to become more odd, erratic, and paranoid. She was in her early 50s when this behavior started. Now we, myself and my sister-in-law with psychology experience, think she has late onset bipolar, and I say think, since we can't get her officially diagnosed, since she believes nothing is wrong with her. She lives in New York, and it is super hard to commit someone there, unless they are a danger to themselves or other people. She's not dangerous, just can't hold down a job, and lives in her car due to her own insubordinate sporadic paranoid behavior, but blames everyone else. No, she's not a narcissist, just mentally ill, since she was never like this when we were growing up. She was very selfless and caring when she was younger. Edit. Hi Redditors, thanks for sharing all your stories. I'm sorry if I couldn't respond to everyone. Ironically, I was just fielding my mom's texts and calls about her most recent job firing this morning on my birthday. I hope everyone who shared a story has an easier time going forward, since that's what I hope this new year brings us as a family. Well, funny story. My parents were high school sweethearts and married for 22 years. Then they got divorced when I was 6. My dad remarried and had another kid and got divorced again. My mom never did. Fast forward about 30 years. I got married. My parents were in the same room for the first time in 30 years and were flirting like teenagers. I have video of it. It really is pretty amusing to watch. Until I remember it's my parents. They have been dating since I got married. That was more than 5 years ago. They are virtually living together, and both of them think it's funny to allude to their sex life around me, so that I'll be embarrassed. Which still works, despite my age. As to your question, my mom says that my dad has mellowed and turned into not a bad guy. My dad says my mom is exactly the same, except her waist. I think they both never found anyone they liked as much as each other, or hated as much as each other. And if that isn't marriage, I don't know what the hell is. My parents divorced when I was a year old due to my dad's alcoholism, and then remarried when I was 3 and he was sober while I was 16. 24 years combined years married at this point. They were filing for divorce again, but were informed by their lawyer that in our you cannot marry the same person 3 times. So they just separated for about a year and then got back together. They just needed a break, I guess, but are stupid for each other and couldn't bear the thought of not being able to try again. My dad is still sober with no relapses and they'll have their 50th anniversary next March. They like each other much better now than they ever did as young people. We were together for 20 years, married for 15. We started as high school sweethearts, but we eventually realized that we weren't the same people we were when we fell in love. We also realized that that wasn't going to change. We decided that the best way for everyone to be happy for the rest of our lives was to end it on peaceful terms before we were both 70 and resentful of each other for trapping each other in an unhappy marriage for 40 plus years. Obligatory, not me, my parents. My dad filed for divorce after 25 years of marriage. My mom was shell-shocked. My dad was absolutely miserable, but the signs of a failed marriage were always present. My dad is very emotional and is quick to anger. He never really handled failure very effectively and would be mad instead of constructive. My mom very family oriented and was adamant that we never move farther than 40 miles from Chicago. Hell, when I was going away to college, she begged to my dad to force me to go to a school closer to home. In a way, I think my dad resented my mom for never letting him travel or get away from Chicago. It also doesn't help that I'm fairly certain my mom became undiagnosed depressed once her mom died. All she would do was do her bare minimum at her job, a school bus driver, come home and sleep, finish her route for the day, cook a hamburger, help a meal for the family, and then play Angry Birds on her iPad. It's really weird seeing your parents divorce in your 20s. You're adult enough to speak candidly and neither of them likes what you have to say about them during or after the fact. The silver lining out of it is my sisters and I know how not to behave in a relationship. Your husband sounds a lot like me. Parents were unhappy as could be and divorced when I was 8. Mom actually convinced me that my dad just up and left us. I resented him for far too long. Didn't realize mom was the reason for the divorce until I was 21. Only time I've seen her in the past 4 years was when my daughter was born and on her first birthday. My dad has tried but a variety of factors prevent us from going to visit him. He eventually told me the truth. When he was in the army, mom cheated on him multiple times while he was deployed various times throughout the mid-90s and early 2000s. Took credit cards out in his name and maximumed them out, never paid a cent on the bills. He had to file bankruptcy and spent the last 15 years rebuilding his credit to the point where he and his now wife of 15 years finally bought their first home at the age of 47. Mom still doesn't understand why I resent her for the way she's lied to me for almost 17 years and for the way she treated my dad. Didn't get divorced, but started the process after about 25 years. Stuck it out for a few more years for the kids and ended up falling in love with her after the kids moved out. Relationships follow cycles, so glad I stuck it out. Not me, but my grandmother once told me that she was considering divorcing her husband of over 50 years. The reason she gave me was, we stayed together for the kids. Now the kids are all grown up and have lives of their own. And now I can't ignore the small things about him, my grandpa, that annoy me. She didn't go through with it, but she seemed sincere when she said it. It broke my heart, especially since I only ever saw the best side of him. A friend of mine was married for nearly 30 years to kids. As she put it, they'd been playing divorce chicken for a decade. There weren't any concrete reasons to get divorced. They didn't fight, they actually got along very well. They just weren't in love anymore. There was always a good pragmatic reason for them to stick together. They co-parented effectively. They actually liked each other. They kept saying their marriage was probably better than a lot of people's. A few years ago they just decided it was time. They went out for drinks and started hashing out how to divide their assets. They agreed on a 50-50 split. They got a lawyer to make everything legit and a few months later they got divorced. My friend's ex-husband rented a house a few blocks away so their kids could easily walk between mom's and dad's house. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized, my friend's ex-husband set her up with a new boyfriend. They go on double dates. They go to parent-teacher conferences together. Not me, but a lady I worked with. Her and her husband had been married for almost 30 years. They had 2 kids, both in their mid-late teens, and a full life together. She was the stay-at-home mom, he made the big bucks, etc. Anyways, once the kids both started to grow up and stop wanting to go to the cottage, they realized that when left alone together they didn't have much in common. Then the kids started leaving for school, and I guess things got worse. I think everything would have been fine if not for the father's dad, the grandfather, getting sick. Turns out the old man had near $4 million to his name and was giving it all to the father. So, dad consults a lawyer who says that, since it's an inheritance, if he's divorced before he gets it, he can keep all of it, and as such, he divorces her within days. She stopped working for us shortly after, but I know it was pretty hard on her. She got her fair shake of the currently owned assets, but couldn't touch the $4 million. Thank you so much for listening. Please, support the channel by subscribing. I know you didn't subscribe, lol. But seriously, please subscribe and like the video. Thanks.